In after their weekly party lunches before the break, the Senate voted to move forward on changes to the U.S. Postal Service, and they will discuss closing post offices and facilities, eliminating Saturday postal delivery, and refunding billions of dollars of overpayment into the Postal Workers' Retirement Fund. We'll return now to the Senate floor as they gavel back in here on C-SPAN 2.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, I know that the senator from Maryland, Mr. Cardin, is on his way to the floor to make a statement, but pending that, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Okaka.
Unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objections, ordered.
Mr. President, may I ask consent to speak as if in morning business?
Without objections, ordered.
Mr. President, I take this time to inform my colleagues of a hearing that took place this morning before the Subcommittee on Constitution, Civil Rights, and Human Rights of the Senate Judiciary Committee, chaired by Senator Durbin. Senator Durbin's been a leader in this body on making sure that we have a committee that focuses on the issues of human rights. And today's hearing on racial profiling, ending racial profiling in America, was the first hearing that we've had in the Congress on racial profiling since the attack on our country on September the 11th. And I want to congratulate Senator Durbin for holding this hearing. I thought the hearing was very informative as to a problem that we have in America on the use of racial profiling. I know that the nation has been focused on the tragedy that took place in Sanford, Florida, in which a 17-year-old, Trayvon Martin, was killed, a clearly avoidable death by Mr. Zimmerman. We first and foremost want to make sure that justice prevails in this case. And I know that there is a case pending in Florida, and we're all going to be watching that very carefully. There's a federal investigation underway by the Department of Justice to look into circumstances concerning Trayvon Martin's death. see what role race played in regards to that tragedy, not only as it related to Trayvon Martin's death, but also as to the investigation that pursued. A few weeks ago, I spoke about this issue at the Center for Urban Families in Baltimore. That's a group that is interested in urban family life, and we came together shortly after Trayvon Martin's tragic death to talk about what had happened. And, Mr. President, I was very much moved by so many people who came forward at that meeting and explained how they had been victims of racial profiling. A young woman talked about when she went to a basketball game with her father, and her father was pulled over and stopped by police for no apparent reason other than the color of his skin, and how that impacted this girl, seeing her father held and unable to go to the basketball game. These types of victims occur too frequently in our community, where people are picked out solely because of their race, their religion, their ethnic background. We have a problem in this country, and we need to do something about that. The question that really needs to be answered in regards to Trayvon Martin was he initially pursued because of the color of his skin? And would Mr. Zimmerman done the same if it was a white child rather than an African American? In October of 2011, I introduced S-1670, it's the End Racial Profiling Act. I'm proud that we have many of my colleagues that are co-sponsors of this legislation, including Senator Blumenthal, Senator Boxer, Senator Durbin, Senator Gillibrand, Senator John Kerry, Senator Lautenberg, Senator Levin, Senator Menendez, Senator Mikulski, Senator Harry Reid, Senator Stabenow, and Senator Mark Udall. And I thank my co-sponsors for joining me in this legislation. This legislation would make it clear that racial profiling will not be allowed in this country. Racial profiling is un-American. It's against the values of our nation. It's contrary to the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which provides for equal protection under the law. It's counterproductive. It doesn't keep us safe. You're using valuable police resources in a way that is wasting those resources. It's sloppy police work if you try to identify a problem by race rather than looking for good police work to identify the real perpetrator of a crime. It also creates a mistrust in the community that you're trying to protect, a community who you need to help you and cooperate with you as far as keeping a community safe. So for all those reasons, racial profiling should have no place in modern law enforcement. We need a national law. Mr. President, I was impressed at the hearing today that there was general consensus that we have a problem in this country, that there is a problem of law enforcement using racial profiling, which should not be done. S-1670 would prohibit the use of racial profiling. That is, making a decision based upon race, ethnicity, national origin, or religion. Basically, what you're doing is subjecting an individual to a spontaneous investigation based upon that person's race, religion, ethnic background, or national origin. That should have no place. What we're talking about is someone being stopped for a routine traffic stop based upon the person's race, or being subject to a search, or being subject to interrogation solely because of that person's race, or that an investigation, the scope and substance of law enforcement activities are following an initial investigative proceeding is determined because of race. That should have no place in America. My legislation would apply to all levels of government, not just the federal, but the state and local. It requires mandatory training. And here's an issue that I think we all should be in agreement. Perhaps the tragedy that happened with Trayvon Martin may not have happened if Mr. Zimmerman had been trained on the issues of what is good police work and what is not good police work, how racial profiling needs to be eliminated. We feel very strongly on the need of mandatory training. The legislation requires data collection by local and state law enforcement State and local law enforcement must maintain adequate policies and procedures designated to eliminate racial profiling. And they must eliminate any existing practices that present or encourage racial profiling. Simple what the legislation does. The Department of Justice is granted authority to make grants to promote best practices, so one jurisdiction can learn from another as to what is the best practices in order to make sure that this practice is not being used, that we're doing everything possible to keep communities safe by good police work, not by sloppy police work. I want to point out that the overwhelming majority of people that are in law enforcement do it the right way. We have dedicated men and women who work every day to keep us safe, our first responders. We owe them our debt of gratitude, we owe them our support, and we cannot say enough complimentary things about what they do every day, putting their life on the line to keep us safe. So for the sake of what is right for America, and for the sake of the overwhelming majority of the people that are professionals in law enforcement, we need to make it clear that racial profiling has no role in American law enforcement. I'm proud of the many groups that are supporting this legislation, the NAACP, the ACLU, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and numerous other organizations. Mr. President, I'll ask unanimous consent that I can put into the record the list of organizations that are supporting the legislation.
Without objection, so ordered.
And let me just conclude by quoting our former colleague, Senator Kennedy, when he said, "The civil rights is the great unfinished business of America." Let us continue to fight to make sure that we have equal justice under the law for all Americans. That's what the legislation that I've introduced will do. The End Racial Profiling Act will continue us on that journey to provide equal justice in the law to all Americans. And with that, Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President.
Senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senators in a quorum call.
I move that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, the issue that we are debating right now is an issue of enormous consequence for the American people, for our economy, for rural America, for the hundreds of thousands of workers in the U.S. Postal Service. And I want to thank Senators Lieberman and Carper and Collins and Brown for the important work that they have done in moving this legislation forward. And let me begin by saying the debate that we are having is not whether the Postal Service in the digital age should change. Everybody agrees that the Postal Service should change. The question is, what kind of change do we want? What kind of change is good for the American economy? And what kind of change is good for our country? Last year, about, I think, 9 or 10 months ago, the Postmaster General gave us his view of change. Concerned about some of the financial problems facing the Post Office, he came up with a proposal, a plan that would do the following. What he said is that we should close more than 3,600 mostly rural post offices. In my state, I think the number is about 15. All over this country where post offices in so many ways serve a function beyond delivering mail or selling stamps, but in many ways become the center of a small town. His proposal was to shut down more than 3,600 mostly rural post offices. Furthermore, what he wanted to do is shut down about half of the mail processing facilities in America, somewhere around 250 of them. And when you do that, by definition, you slow overnight delivery standards for first-class mail. So at a moment when the Postal Service is being challenged by email in the digital age, instantaneous communication, he was proposing to slow down mail delivery. He also proposed to end Saturday mail service and reduce the postal workforce in the midst of a horrendous recession by some 220,000 workers, going from 550,000 down to about 330,000. And I find it a bit ironic, Mr. President, that a couple of months ago we had a great debate here, and I think bipartisan support to make sure that veterans get the jobs that they need. Well, many of the people who work in the Postal Service are, in fact, veterans. They're doing a good job. And when you downsize the Postal Service, as the Postmaster General proposed, by 220,000 workers, you are downsizing many of our veterans. Mr. President, I and many of my colleagues in the Senate and in the House are strongly opposed what the Postmaster General brought forth, and we have been working with him and his staff to improve this plan, and frankly, I think we are making some progress. Obviously, the key danger of what the Postmaster General has proposed is that if you slow down mail delivery standards, what ends up happening is that individuals and businesses will be rethinking about whether or not they want to use the Postal Service and whether or not they want to go elsewhere. So what you could very well begin is what we call a death spiral. Slow down mail delivery service, businesses stop using the Postal Service, less revenue comes in, more cuts are made, more delays, more slowdowns. We think that that is a bad idea. So again, I believe, and I think everybody in this Senate believes, we need a new business model for the Postal Service in the digital age. Some of us believe we can bring forth a new business model which does not necessitate hundreds of thousands of job losses and cuts, and cuts. Among other things, I would like to point out that a recently disclosed study by Opinion Research Corporation, commissioned by the Postal Service itself, found that the Postal Service would lose nearly $2 billion by eliminating overnight delivery standards. Let me repeat, a study commissioned by the Postal Service found that ending overnight delivery standards and shutting down half of the mail processing plants in America would cost the Postal Service nearly $2 billion. And the answer is a lot to do with what I just said. You slow down service, fewer and fewer people are going to be using the Postal Service. Mr. President, for the last several months, I've been working with several dozen of my colleagues in the Senate to oppose those cuts. And we have been working, and I want to thank Senator Lieberman and Senator Carper for their support, Senator Collins, Senator Brown. We've been working with them, and what basically we said is, you came up with a good bill, a bill that was much better than what the Postmaster General had originally proposed, but we think we could do better. And in fact, we have been working, and I think it is fair to say that we have made some significant improvements which have been incorporated in the substitute amendment that is before us. And let me begin by touching on some of the improvements that I think we have brought about. Number one, the manager's amendment brings more protection for rural post offices. I come from a rural state. I know how important rural post offices are, and the manager's amendment provides more protection for these rural post offices. The substitute amendment would prevent the Postal Service from closing any post offices until it has established a set of service standards that would guarantee all postal customers regular and effective access to retail postal services nationwide on a reasonable basis. The Postal Service is required to establish these standards within 6 months. The service standards would be required to take into account the following factors. In other words, what we're talking about here is that before a rural post office can be shut down, certain standards are going to have to be addressed. Number one, a consideration of the reasonable maximum time a postal customer should expect to travel to access a postal retail location. In other words, if you shut down a post office and somebody has to go 20 miles and spend money on gasoline, an enormous amount of time, it doesn't make sense to shut down that rural post office. Furthermore, we want to look at the age and disability status of individuals in the area. If you have elderly people, if you have a large number of disabled people, and you shut down that postal service, those folks are really going to be, for all intent and purposes, isolated. Don't shut down that postal service, that post office. C, there would be a requirement that the Postal Service serve remote areas and communities which have transportation challenges. What happens if I live in a community and I don't have a car? How do I get to a postal service that is a post office that is 5 miles away from here? D, the effects of inclement weather or other natural conditions that might impede access to postal services. In other words, if you live in a climate where you have a whole lot of snow, how are people going to get to another post office? I see the Majority Leader standing. Ms. Leader, did you want to?
Procedural things to do, but you should finish your statement.
All right, I'll be another 5-10 minutes.
Well.
All right, then I would yield to the Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I ask consent that when I finish my.
Majority Leader is recognized.
I ask when I finish my procedural stuff, the senator from Vermont will be recognized.
Without objection.
And that his statement will not appear interrupted in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that all post-cloture time be yielded back and the motion to proceed to S. 1789 be agreed to.
Without objection. Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I now ask unanimous consent that the only amendments in order to S. 1789 or the Lieberman-Collins substitute amendment number 2000 be those that are relevant to the bill or the substitute amendment.
Is there objection? Senator from Kentucky.
Reserving the right to object, Egypt currently gets $2 billion from our country, from the U.S. taxpayer. And my question is that a country that gets $2 billion a year, should we be sending it to them when they continue to seek to prosecute American citizens? Now, recently, President Obama's administration freed up that money and said Egypt is pursuing democratic aims. And so we freed up the $2 billion. How did Egypt respond to this? Egypt basically thumbed their nose at us. Egypt said, we are now issuing international warrants to get American citizens, extradite them, take them back to Egypt for a political show trial. So we give money to a country that insults us. I think this should end. I think this deserves 15 minutes of Senate time where we discuss whether or not America has money to be sending to Egypt when we have 12 million people unemployed in this country. Whether or not we have needs here at home that need to be met before we send $2 billion to Egypt, who turns around and insults us by prosecuting American citizens. So I respectfully object and seek a vote on this amendment that would end their aid if they do not end the prosecution of American citizens.
Mr. President.
The objection is heard. The majority leader is recognized.
Mr. President, as we speak, there are 8 million Americans who are dependent on the post office. These are people who have jobs as a result of the Postal Service. We need to do a postal reform bill. Doing nothing is not an option. I ask unanimous consent that we set up a procedure to allow the Senate to consider amendments relevant to the postal reform bill.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
Mr. President.
Reserving the right to object, the post office is losing $4 billion a year, and I sympathize. But at the same time we're losing $4 billion a year, we're sending $2 billion to Egypt. We've got problems in our country, and we don't have the money to send to Egypt, so I would say that it is relevant. It is relevant whether we have limited resources and we send $2 billion to Egypt or whether we try to fix the problems we have at home. So I would say bring some of that money home, and that might help you fix the post office.
The senator yield.
Mr. President, first, would the Senate
Is there objection to the senator's request?
And I continue my objection.
would the chair report the bill, please?
The objection is heard. Majority leader is recognized. The clerk will report the pending amendment. The pending business.
Calendar number 296, S-1789, a bill to improve, sustain, and transform the United States Postal Service.
Majority leader.
The relevance is a fair standard. A lot of amendments could be offered. Very few couldn't be offered unless it were something dealing with foreign policy on the Postal Service bill. A lot of people want to offer amendments dealing with situations all over the world. That's why we struggled, for example, to get the Iran sanctions bill moving. The standard of relevance merely asks that we stay on the subject. A subject this morning which 74 senators agreed to vote. I regret that my friend has objected to this request. Mr. President, but I hope that my friend from Kentucky will go home and explain to the people who are dependent on those small post offices around the state of Kentucky and those processing centers that this bill has not been resolved because of him. Mr. President, if we do nothing, there will be wide-ranging closing of post offices. We have more than 30,000 post offices in America. Many of them will be closed. We have hundreds and hundreds of processing centers. They will be closed. Postal Service, as we've known it, is a fleeting moment in the eyes of Americans when they can't get their medicine that they want, they can't get the mail that they want. Now, the volume is down a lot, but that's what this bill is about, to address some of the problems we have with what we need to have as a new Postal Service. The chairman of the committee, Senator Lieberman, has worked extremely hard. Senator Collins has spent lots and lots of time on this. And of course, Tom Carper, who has a tremendous interest in this, has been working on this for a long time. It is a shame that we've had this objection. It leaves me with absolutely no alternative but to fill the amendment tree and make sure that we stick to the subject of postal reform. I remain hopeful that we'll be able to work together to get agreement for consideration amendments related to this most important task, saving the Postal Service. I've been authorized by the chairman of the Senate Homeland and Government Affairs Committee to withdraw the committee report substitute amendment.
The amendment is withdrawn.
On behalf of Senators Lieberman, Collins, and others, I call amendment number 2000, which is at the desk.
Clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, for Mr. Lieberman and others, proposes amendment number 2000.
I ask for the yeas and nays on that.
Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be.
I have a first-degree perfecting amendment to the desk.
Clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes amendment number 2013 to amendment number 2000.
I ask for the yeas and nays on that amendment, Mr. President.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be.
I have a second-degree amendment.
Yeas and nays are ordered.
I have a second-degree amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes amendment number 2014 to amendment number 2013.
I have a cloture motion at the desk.
Clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the Lieberman-Collins substitute amendment number 2000 to S. 1789, the 21st Century Postal Service Act, signed by 16 senators, as follows.
I ask for the reading of the names be waived, Mr. President.
Without objection.
I have an amendment at the desk to the language proposed to be stricken.
Clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes amendment number 2015 to the language proposed to be stricken by amendment number.
I ask for the yeas and nays on that amendment.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered.
I have a second-degree amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes amendment number 2016 to amendment number 2015.
I have a cloture motion at the desk.
Clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on S. 1789, the 21st Century Postal Service Act, signed by 16 senators, as follows.
As for the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I ask for the yeas and nays on the motion.
The yeas and
President,
nays are not necessary.
I got ahead of myself. Reading was one of my better subjects, but I skipped a line. I have a motion to recommit the bill with instructions, which is at the desk.
Clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, moves to commit the bill as 1789 to the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs with instructions to report back forthwith amendment numbered 2017.
I ask for the yeas and nays on that motion now, Mr. President.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be.
I have an amendment.
The yeas and nays are ordered.
I have an amendment to the instructions, which is at the desk.
Clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes amendment number 2018 to the instructions of amendment number 2017 to the motion to recommit.
I ask for the yeas and nays on that amendment.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered.
I have a second-degree amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
The Senator from Nevada, Mr. Reed, proposes amendment number 2019 to amendment number 2018.
Mr. President, I have another matter of business here, but I just want to say, all senators here, not just the senator from Kentucky who objected to a reasonable manner to proceed in this matter, but all states are going to be dramatically impacted by virtue of his objection. Post offices in Nevada will be closed. Minnesota, Massachusetts, Tennessee, unnecessarily. We need to be able to work through this, Mr. President. And there is no, I don't know how anyone could object to a standard like we've had, that I proposed. relevant amendments. It is really too bad. 8 million people depend on the post office. 500, that's 8 million people who work as a result of the post office. 500,000 people work for the post office directly. So we have an obligation to do something about this legislation. And even though my friend, who is one of the leaders of the Tea Party movement around the country, has thrown a monkey wrench into what we're doing here by, on a postal bill, moving some foreign relations matter, it is really too bad. It cheapens what we're trying to do here, and it's unfortunate for millions of people in America. Mr. President, I move to proceed to count number 325, S-1925, a bill to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act.
The motion is pending.
For a 2-minute, yes.
The Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, what we have just witnessed here is an example of why the United States Senate is too often tied in the knots. We have a bill that's critical to every one of our states that's pending, the postal reform bill. The leader tried to move this bill forward by saying, let's stick to relevant amendments, relevant to the bill, which is a pretty broad standard, but a lot broader than a germane standard, a germaneness standard. Then there's an objection to that because there's another matter which the Senator from Kentucky rightfully has an interest in. We all have an interest in various matters around here, many of which are $2 billion or more in terms of cost. But that bill is not, that amendment of the Senator from Kentucky is not relevant to this bill. And unless he says he gets his way and has a 15-minute debate on a $2 billion subject, he's going to object to us addressing a subject which is involving every one of our states. Now, this is why we have so many difficulties here, at times at least, moving forward in the Senate, because any one of us at any time can object to moving legislation that is relevant and amendments that are relevant in order to get his or her way on a totally unrelated amendment.
May I interject with a question?
I asked to be yielded 2 times. That would be up to the senator. That would be up to the senator from Vermont.
Could I interject with a question?
I just want to simply say that then what happens, Mr. President, is that then the majority leader is forced to fill the tree. That creates problems on the other side, because the tree is filled. But that's in response to an unwillingness on the part of a senator to let us proceed on a bill which is important to every one of us with relevant amendments. So you got a response from that senator to the determination of the majority leader to move forward with a bill that affects all of us. Objecting to a UC, the majority leader is forced to fill the tree, and we're off and running. So for 2 days around here, now, we're going to go through the same thing we go through almost every single week. We'll have amendments which will be sought to be offered. We have to set aside amendments. We get the cloture vote. We end up with a far more restrictive standard than if we were allowed to proceed with relevant amendments. We end up with a germaneness standard a lot narrower than the relevant standard which was proposed by the majority leader. This was a self-defeating action, I believe, in objecting to a unanimous consent proposal which would allow us to proceed with relevant amendments. It doesn't accomplish the aim of the senator from Kentucky, because we're not going to get to that subject, and all it does is restrict the rest of us who are trying to offer relevant amendments in the next few days. And it's a real example of what the problem is around this Senate.
Will the senator yield for a question? Since I'm being characterized, I would think I would be allowed a response.
Under the order that was entered, the senator from Vermont is to be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. The senator from Tennessee has requested 2 or 3 minutes to make a point, and I'm happy to yield some of my time. Pardon? And after which I would get the floor back.
Good question as well.
Well, Senator Alexander, may I ask a question?
Is there objection to the senator from Vermont's request?
Yes.
That the
right.
senator
I would
from
say to the
Tennessee be
senator from
recognized,
Tennessee,
and then that...
I really want to ask a question,
I would-
Mr. President.
I apologize to the senator from Tennessee. I want to yield to
Is there objection to the senator from Vermont's request?
Yes.
Objection is heard. The senator from Vermont has the floor.
I do apologize to my friend from Tennessee. I wanted just to continue and talk about what the manager's amendment is doing. So I went over a number of criteria by which it strengthens our ability to protect rural post offices. And that's something I think many of us from rural America want to see happen. We understand how important rural post offices are to the heart and soul of small communities. The Lieberman-Collins bill took us a good way forward. This amendment goes further. Now, I should say that while I think the manager's amendment is a step forward in almost every instance, I believe that through the amendment process, we can strengthen the bill even further. And I intend to be working with many of my colleagues to do just that. So we talked a little bit about strengthening the ability of rural post offices to continue to exist. Second issue, the manager's amendment protects regional overnight delivery standards. The manager's amendment requires that the Postal Service retain a modified overnight delivery standard for 3 years, ensuring that communities across the country continue to receive overnight delivery of first-class mail, a very significant step forward for small businesses and for people throughout our country. A maximum delivery standard of 3 days would also be maintained for first-class mail sent anywhere in the continental United States. Originally, Postmaster General had suggested that maybe we can lengthen the time from 3 days to 5 days. We keep it at 3 days. The retention of, and this is important for every member of the United States Senate concerned about the employment situation, the retention of a modified overnight delivery standard would result in at least 100 mail processing facilities remaining open that are now scheduled to be closed. Number 3, the manager's amendment makes it harder to eliminate 6-day delivery. The substitute amendment would prohibit the Postal Service from implementing any plan to eliminate Saturday delivery for at least 2 years. After 2 years, Saturday delivery could only be eliminated if the Postal Service has first attempted to increase revenue and cut costs through other means, and the GAO and the Postal Regulatory Commission conclude that eliminating Saturday delivery is necessary for the long-term solvency of the Postal Service. Fourth, and very importantly, something that I and many other members feel strongly about, the Postal Service needs a new business model. Let me, Mr. President, and I know the senator from Minnesota has been very interested in all of these postal issues. Right now, if one walks into a post office and you say to the postal clerk, "Hi, I'd like to give you $2 to notarize this letter," postal clerk would say, "It's against the law for me to do that. Can't take you $2. Postal clerk, can you make 10 copies of this letter? Nope, it is against the law for me to do that. Rural postal clerk, I would like a fishing license or a hunting license. Can you help me with that? Can't do that, against the law. I want to mail this box of wine and beer. Can't do that, it is against the law." So what we want to do is take away many of the restrictions that have been imposed on the Postal Service by Congress, give them the flexibility to be more entrepreneurial, to bring in more revenue. In addition to that, this manager's amendment creates a blue ribbon entrepreneurial commission. What that is about is that today we have, as the majority leader indicated, some 32,000 post offices in America. Today, postal letter carriers are delivering mail to about 150 million doors in America. That is a huge infrastructure. If we have some pretty smart entrepreneurial types telling us what we can do in addition to what we are doing now, what the letter carriers could do, what the post offices could do, what the Postal Service could do in terms of new products and services. Can we bring in more revenue? I think we can, and that's what the Commission is going to be looking at. Let me just say a few words about the financial condition of the Postal Service. No one debates. First-class mail is down. A lot of people now use the email and the Internet rather than first-class mail. No debate about that. But what many people, including many members of Congress, don't fully understand is that the major crisis, major financial crisis facing the Postal Service is the fact that they have an onerous burden of having to provide $5.5 billion every single year in future retiree health benefits, $5.5 billion every year, which was imposed upon them in 2006. According to the Inspector General of the Postal Service, the $44 billion in that account right now is all that it needs, because when that $44 billion accrues interest over a 20-year or so period, it will have enough money to pay out all of the future retiree health benefits that it has to do. Furthermore, there is, in general, not disagreement that the Postal Service has overpaid into the Federal Employment Retirement Service by about $11 billion and to the Civil Service Retirement Service about $2 billion. In other words, the Postal Service is owed about $13 billion. So to conclude, let me just say this. The Postal Service performs an enormously important function for millions of individuals and for our economy as a whole. As the Majority Leader indicated, there are some 8 million jobs in a variety of industries dependent upon a strong Postal Service. I believe that if the Senate is prepared to be bold, to do the right thing, we can save jobs. We do not need to lay off or to downsize the Postal Service by over 200,000 workers. We do not need to shut down over 3,000 rural post offices. We do not need to shut down half of the processing plants in America and slow down mail delivery service, leading to an eventual death cycle for the Postal Service. So the task before us is a huge one. And to tell you the truth, that I speak as an independent, longest-serving independent in congressional history, this is not a Democratic issue. This really is not a Republican issue. Republicans, Democrats have rural post offices, all know how important they are. All want to save jobs in the middle of recession. All want the Postal Service to be strong. So, Mr. President, I would hope that we can work together. We had a good vote a few hours ago, 74 votes. I would hope that we could work together to save the Postal Service, make it strong, make sure that it is there for our kids and our grandchildren. Mr. President, at this point, if the senator from Tennessee would like some time, I'm happy to yield him 3 minutes.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. President.
The senator from Tennessee.
I thank the senator from Vermont.